Welcome to ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology, where we have engaging conversations with leading rheumatology professionals on topics such as the latest research on rheumatic diseases, solutions for addressing practice management issues, legislative policies impacting patient care, and more. Here's your host.
Welcome back to another episode of ACR On Air, the official podcast of the American College of Rheumatology. I am your host, Dr. John Hausman. Show notes for this episode can be found at acronair.org. You can also find our previous episodes on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on your favorite podcast app. When I wake up in the morning, I ask Siri about the weather. As I leave my home, the thermostat adjusts the temperature depending on the weather and the electricity demand from the local power grid. My Twitter feed, my X feed, presents curated content optimized to keep me engaged in the platform. My car drives itself while receiving real-time traffic updates as it moves. Amazon shows me the items it knows that I want to buy. And when I make that purchase, my credit card analyzes the transaction to see if it's fraudulent. While I'm at work, my robotic vacuum cleaner starts cleaning my home and successfully avoids falling down the stairs. All of these tasks are now possible thanks to artificial intelligence, and the AI revolution is just beginning. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Suleiman Bana, one of the hosts of the OG Rheumatology podcast and a techie at heart. In this episode, we discuss the future of AI in rheumatology. We begin by explaining the different facets of AI, including machine learning, neural networks, and generative AI. We talk about how technologies such as ChatGPT and Google's Gemini are already affecting both consumer and medical worlds. We address how AI is already being implemented in disease diagnosis, especially in radiology. We discuss the potential of AI to deliver truly personalized medicine and to help patients better manage their rheumatic disease. We discuss how AI can improve remote patient monitoring, which may actually help the shortage of rheumatologists nationwide. And finally, we discuss some of the limitations of AI, including issues with privacy, security, and ethics. Dr. Bana is a board-certified rheumatologist in the northern New Jersey area. He's a medical podcaster and also a digital health expert. He has a long history of volunteering with the ACR. He was part of the steering committee of the COVID-19 Global Rheumatology Alliance, and he is the former chair of the Communications and Marketing Committee of the ACR. While chair of the CMC, Dr. Bana actually helped to start the ACR On Air podcast that you all love so much. So if you're enjoying the podcast, please thank him. After a decade in private practice, Dr. Bana made the career transition to industry, and he currently works for Pfizer Medical Affairs. Suleiman, it's great to have you back on the show.
Oh, great to be back, John. It's like putting on an old pair of shoes again that just fits so nice.
I hope that's the case. Hey, so today we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. And why is there so much excitement about artificial intelligence these days? What do you think is going on?
Great question. Yeah, just real quick disclosure. So I'm a rheumatologist, but I do work for a biopharma industry, although the views I'm representing today are views of my own and not related to my employer. But AI is big in every sector you're hearing. We do a lot from consumer world to the medical world. I really do think there's a true interest in leveraging technology tools to help patients for patient outcomes, patient care, better diagnostics, predictions of disease, management of patients, and just better health. I think there's excitement to kind of use new technology and tools for that, as it's been for a long time, no matter what tech you're talking about. This is a new type of tech. But I think underneath that layer, nothing moves in the world without funding. So I think where a lot of the funding is coming from is definitely big companies, but a lot of investment, like VC investors, are looking at this as kind of ways to profit from the system, just to be in reality. And I think some of that may be about IP and licensing new tools, but some of it could also be about potentially replacing parts of the system that are human based and maybe changing that to that more machine based and then recouping that cost somehow. And I think we want to be very cognizant of that there's sort of two different sides of this coin. And hopefully it's the side that wins for patients and for the people that take care of them. But we should always look at the other side of the coin too.
Absolutely. People have been working on artificial intelligence for years and years and years, but it's hit the mainstream with ChatGPT, and I think it's in the fall of 2022, where these large language models became readily available for anyone to ask questions and get help in writing essays or crafting questions for podcasts, hypothetically speaking. I remember when Google started, and you were able to search the internet for anything that you could want. I remember sort of that revolution, and I felt the same when I started using ChatGPT for the first time, that wow, like here's a whole new technology that can really help us in our daily lives.
I mean, I think in preparation for this podcast, I was just going through some of the buzzword search terms that we've been hearing a lot. So I thought it may be helpful for both me and the listenership just to go through a few of the common definitions to make sure we're kind of level setting on what all these terms mean, because they're actually changing over time. So I think first thing is just AI. What is artificial intelligence? I found a great quick definition from IBM, of no surprise, which is artificial intelligence is technology that enables computers and machines to simulate human intelligence and problem solving capabilities. So it's not just about can you compute faster, or do you have more transistors, is it better bit rates? This really is about simulating the human mind and kind of the way the human mind works. And then with that comes to, all right, well, what is types of artificial intelligence like machine learning? We keep hearing about that in a real meta type of way, not Meta the company, but meta in terms of trying to find a definition. I went to Google's AI, Gemini, which they have now embedded in all Google search. If you just look at the top bar now. So, well, what is machine learning? Google Gemini. So what Google Gemini tells me is that machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence that allows computers to learn and then improve without being explicitly programmed to do the next task. So what machine learning does is that it uses very complex algorithms to analyze the very large buckets of data, which you also probably hear the term big data coming around, and then identify patterns in this big data, and then create models that can then make predictions. And then it self-propagates and self-learns without necessarily programming each step of the way. So as computers gain more experience in data, then the results theoretically should become more accurate to how humans work, although we've been hearing the phrase a lot as to a garbage in, garbage out, so that it's really important when training machine learning models to make sure what's called validation is important, that the data going into it has good integrity, because then it'll just compound errors going through. And then the last three things I'll just mention for definitions to make sure I'm on the same page and our listenership's on the same page is that neural networks. What is that? So it's basically what you think it would be, kind of simulating the human brain, where structures and functions in a neural network model is simulating the biologic neural processes in a organic animal brain or even a human brain. So human brains have neurons, but in the programming world, it's called nodes. And then those neurons are connected by synapses in our biologic speaking, but in the computer programming world, those are called edges to connect each of those nodes. And then that enables these systems to do what's called deep learning. So again, IBM is defining that for us. So deep learning is when you take machine learning and neural networks, and you have multi-layers of these networks, and then you can simulate very complex decision making, which is what the human brain actually does. And that gets more closely to artificial intelligence. And then to round it all out back to the top, where we're talking about ChatGPT is what we call generative AI, also known as Gen AI for short. And there's a nice definition from techtarget.com, which is Gen AI. It's a type of artificial intelligence that leverages all these things we spoke about, which is machine learning, neural networks, deep learning, and that can produce content that didn't technically exist before. It's actually producing something new, whether it's text or imagery or audio, but it's essentially synthetic data. So ChatGPT is an example of producing primarily text, but there's other examples that the listenership may have heard of, like DALL-E or Midjourney, producing images. There's now applications producing video. So if you want to have a nice chuckle and go down a rabbit hole, go on YouTube and type in Will Smith eating spaghetti from 2023. And you'll see this really bizarre video of a generative AI video of Will Smith eating spaghetti, but he looks really distorted and his mouth is all weird and the spaghetti looks all weird. And that was from last year. And then Google Sora, Sora, generative AI video on YouTube. And you'll see that it's a completely synthetic video that looks near photorealistic, probably better than what you see on console gaming, but none of that exists in reality. It was all generated by AI. That's in 1 year, the jump. We can only imagine in all this Gen AI what happens in another year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. So anyway, sorry for the long tangent, but I think it's a good way to just level set and make sure we're all kind of understanding the same things here.
I love it. And we'll have those links for listeners on acronair.org and on your podcast app so that you'll be able to access them and check out those videos. When you mentioned machine learning, it reminded me of the immune system, how the humoral immune system, when it identifies bacteria, that it gradually gets better and better at fighting it and finding the best antibodies to target that bacterium. So it's similar to how machines are doing the same thing over and over again and slowly getting better at their target.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's memory, right? Our immune systems have memory, just as our neuronal cells carry our memory. And I think as the technology improves, we've been hearing now about Google's foray into quantum computing, which is a way of, instead of having multiple or millions of transistors or billions of transistors on a chip, where each transistor is essentially a 0 or 1 off switch, you can have a transistor that essentially has almost infinite levels of on and off switch for quantum computing. And so this can enable levels of computational power that have been unheard of in history. And that can be potentially powering all of these neural networks in probably future nearer than we think it's going to come.
Super crazy. So let's start off with where we are today with artificial intelligence. How are you using AI in your daily life?
Here's an example. Maybe I should say this or not. I don't know. I can say it. So board review questions. We all have board review questions we do, MOC. So it's open book. We're allowed to use whatever resource we can as long as we're not sharing questions with others. And so typically we would pull up to date or, manuscripts that we have saved and answer those questions in that 2.5 minute time. But I did just curiosity, just use ChatGPT for like a few board questions. And in some cases it was accurate. In some cases it was not, or it didn't capture maybe the nuance of what the question was asking. And that's where our own internal pattern recognition of what our mentors have told us when we were training, which is our patients are our best students, or our patients are our best teachers rather, and we're the students of our patients. So that as you learn from your patients, that informs your understanding of disease, of illness, how to treat that. And that's what the board review question is supposed to be testing. So I think that's an example of like how, as those models get better, what does that mean for us that are taking our board certification exams? Does it really matter that we become library deposits of lots of rote memorization versus we are really there to synthesize the information that's accessible? I think other ways we're talking about earlier is just Google search. So how many billions of searches per day is Google having, and how much are we participating in that every time we look up something? I have to make dinner. How do I grill boneless chicken thigh? Or how do I fix the plumbing under my sink that just went wrong? What's this sound in my car that's happening that I don't know who I should take to fix it? So we're putting these searches into Google and we're getting these AI searches back that's scrubbing the web, aggregating it, and then generating data that didn't really exist. And then on our social media, we're having it too. So in my Instagram page, and I was just doing a search for something, and now embedded in Meta's Instagram search is their AI. You can't avoid it, actually. Like, you have to actually use it if you want to search. So what they're doing is they're aggregating the data I'm putting into it along with everything that's being put out there on the web. And so I think from a consumer level, we're seeing this stuff in real time. As to like on a medical level, I think a lot of this stuff is more behind the scenes though. I think we're assuming that, for example, when we go to manage patients or when we are a patient going for medical care and submitting claims, for example, that there's always a human that's reviewing these things. So not all the time now. There's AI that's going through.
Yeah, I thought it was just this machine that says reject all the time. There's not much intelligence required for that.
There you go. I mean, maybe it's not so artificial. It's just low intelligence. But yeah, I think that's a way also that it's probably happening around us. We're just not necessarily aware or privy to it, though.
That's such a good insight, Suleiman. I have to say, I've also tried using ChatGPT for like MOC and have gotten, like you said, several questions wrong when I go with ChatGPT's recommendation. And actually, I think the latest time I tried taking some of those MOC questions, there was a warning that actually did not allow you to use large language models to answer questions anymore. So even though I think it was allowed at some point, I think there's now warnings that we shouldn't use it. But I agree. I think it's still not up to par, as you and I mentioned, that it seems like there's something that we know that the computers may not yet realize. There's a common sense about what the patient may or may not have that, at least as of today, ChatGPT may be missing. So how did we get there? I mean, we still had to memorize and learn like everything in rheumatology to be able to discern whether ChatGPT is wrong or right. And I just wonder about the future. If we don't have that backbone of rheumatology, are we going to be missing things because we're going to be overly reliant on these systems that spit out an answer that we may not be able to judge whether or not it's correct?
No, it's a great point. I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier is that these large language models and machine learning, they're really only as good as the data that goes into it. And I think what we're seeing right now, particularly with, for example, Reddit, which is one of the biggest social media posting platforms in terms of at least text data and images, when Reddit disabled their third party API for third party apps, that was really in response to ChatGPT. Because what they're saying is that ChatGPT, you are scrubbing all of our user data and you're using that to inform on your large language models for Gen AI. And it's all for free for you. And then you're turning around and selling that and making a commercial product out of it. And so, why should we give that for free? So, I think in a lot of cases, what we are used to in terms of the free web, in terms of easily obtaining data that you're really not overtly paying for, although you can argue that when you're using Google, you are paying for it. You're basically just providing them data to submit advertisements to you. But that won't be as open as I think we're used to. And I think we'll be seeing more paywalls of valuable data and how that gets leveraged, whether we're talking about consumer-based data that's on the World Wide Web, or you're talking about EHR data that maybe Epic has access to by looking at your unstructured notes in your charts. And how are they scrubbing all your unstructured notes and then creating large language models to look for patterns, whether it's patterns about clinical decision support tools that may be helpful for you managing patients, or maybe it's scrubbing your data to see is there something that can make a marketable product for them to sell on the back end, because data is valuable. Data is like gold nowadays.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting what is happening to healthcare and AI today, and we can dig a little bit deeper into that. AI in healthcare, where are we? Do you know places where it's actually being used?
I think, and in true spirit, I put it to ChatGPT. How is AI being used in rheumatology? And I tried some other AI, Gen AI models to see is what it's saying up to par. But I think generally what it said is relatively true about 5 buckets of where you're seeing this. So the first bucket is something you would probably expect and want to see, which is diagnostics and early detection. And I think we can all agree that even before AI, all the data we've seen about disease management is that early diagnosis, early management, patients generally do better than waiting till things really get out of hand. So early detection diagnostics, important for a long time, regardless of AI. But AI has a role in that. So one that we've seen a lot in from our radiology colleagues is imaging detection. So I think the oncology world has definitely been ahead of us on that in terms of looking for or using AI for imaging, particularly in CAT scan, PET scan imaging, MRIs. But we've also seen, if you look at the last maybe 4 or 5 ACR meetings, the abstracts, and just scanning them for words like AI or AI image recognition, you'll see a lot more abstracts about work being done, whether it's on the OAN, inflammatory arthritis, or hand arthritis, or sacroiliac joint imaging for spondy, and also vascular imaging too for vasculitis. So I think the way that would generally work is you take thousands of images, you validate them based on human level validation of trained radiologists who are looking at these and grading them, adjudicating them, and then you're submitting these into a neural network, a large training model to sort of train up on this from the human base. And then you give it new images to look at and you compare it to see how it is working off the validation models.
And the idea for rheumatology is that AI can evaluate an x-ray of the hand and say, this patient likely has osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis or gout or psoriatic arthritis without a radiologist involvement.
Exactly, yeah. In fact, I read an interesting paper coming out of India where they were using smartphone capture images of hands. They were using one of these pop-up light boxes that you can get off for like $25 on Amazon. That has like a built-in LED light for like putting stuff on eBay or jewelry or something. Yeah. And they would submit these into a neural network AI model. And they were looking at two things: size of the joints, compared to sizes within the same patient, as well as degrees of color, so erythema. And we're using that to train about whether there was inflammatory arthritis or not, or identifying osteophytes, depending on the joint location, though, and showing some interesting proof of concept results. I think if you follow that thought process, this may have applications for telemedicine, for example. So I think one of the big issues that the ACR has been trying to address, and unfortunately is getting more challenging each year, is about workforce shortage for access to care, particularly in more rural and remote areas. I mean, you're out of Boston, I'm out of the New York, New Jersey area. There are a lot of rheumatologists where we live, but parts of the country, there's not a rheumatologist for 300 miles. So if a patient needs monitoring, theoretically, they can go to a site or a location that has an area where they can take smartphone images, or maybe the patient can do it themselves under appropriate lighting. That gets submitted, then an AI model can look at that and then give some level of feedback for, is that patient having inflammatory arthritis or not. That's an example where this proof of concept may be helpful, but I think with any technology, we have to also make sure there are safeguards for equity in patients, that there isn't bias that's creeping in there. So, for example, if we are only training image recognition models of skin off one skin tone, what happens when you have other skin tones involved? I think we've seen this challenge a lot in cutaneous lupus, for example, in terms of people of color, particularly African American people, having their disease recognized, their flares recognized when they're not presenting with erythema the way you would see in a Caucasian patient or maybe a East Asian patient, but presenting differently. So I think these proofs of concepts for imaging recognition, particularly for cutaneous imaging recognition, are very interesting and compelling. But I think it's up to those of us that manage patients, care a lot about patients, to make sure that bias is not creeping in when these things are implemented.
Yeah, and I think it's great you mentioned photographs and images. It's my understanding that these days AI can recognize, for instance, melanoma in the skin as good as or better than a dermatologist can, just from a photograph.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine going forward, like you mentioned, taking a picture of a hand, a foot, an ankle, a rash, and getting a diagnosis from that. That's incredible. So image recognition, both radiologically and pictorially from a photograph, to be able to make a diagnosis. That's awesome and incredible. What's next?
So along that same lines about diagnosis and detection is where this big data part comes into. So that imaging is a piece of it, but then if you can integrate all this data that's floating around in data warehouses, so clinical records, laboratory markers, genomics, and then incorporate that along with population-based data. So for example, in lupus, like what is the incidence of lupus in particular areas of the world or in the country? And if you have a patient in that area, and incorporating other data like their genomics, their symptoms, and putting that into large learning models, can you help to predict disease onset, disease flares, disease management in a way that's better than what we're used to doing, which is provider and patient in an exam room and then deciding on sort of symptom by symptom or lab by lab basis, though. And that's coming. But I think a lot of this comes into this battle between who has the data, where's this data coming from, what is the purity of this data, what's the cost of it going to be to kind of leverage these different data warehouses and synthesize them and integrate them. But it's going to happen. And at some point, you may be in your EHR and may click on a button for the AI to figure this all out for you.
Interesting. So the idea with that is that if the patient has gone to their PCP complaining of fatigue and maybe had a dermatology appointment with a rash, based on certain parameters about who the patient is and their genomics and other history, the AI will say this patient is at increased risk of lupus, or this patient may already have lupus, even way before the disease gets up to the level where they get referred to a rheumatologist.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's something which would probably be welcomed as, in light of what we are just talking about, which is extreme challenges to access to care for patients, so that at least if we can get better detection, better diagnostics before the patient has to wait the months and months and months to see a rheumatologist, then perhaps that can get us that closer to that patient at least getting some relief. Although that's another story, in terms of how can that be improved through AI and these kind of digital models.
Yep, that's great. So we're thinking about image recognition, diagnosis. I think for the diagnosis, I think many of us are already using AI in especially diagnosing complex patients. I remember putting it into Google, right? Oh, this patient has all these symptoms and trying to find whether there's one disease that explains all their symptoms. And nowadays, I'm certainly leveraging ChatGPT when I have a patient with a bunch of different signs and symptoms and trying to put it together to one diagnosis, trying to use ChatGPT to help me develop a differential diagnosis and maybe think about tests that I will want to order.
Agreed. I think the flip side of that is that while we on the physician or provider end are looking at these things, there are patients who are constantly out there that have a degree of symptoms that are Googling and putting into these now AI algorithms what these symptoms actually mean. And in some cases, it may guide them towards a diagnosis that could be closer to what they have. And in some cases, it may give them wrong or perhaps even harmful information. And I think we have to be cognizant to make sure physicians and providers and patient advocates have a true voice in where these decisions are made by technology companies, that we don't essentially live in a techno autocracy, that at least there is true patient care that's kind of involved there. I also worry genuinely that if these AI models, these symptom trackers, are referring patients inappropriately, it could, if anything, magnify the access to care issues that we're seeing right now. I mean, we already have this with just ANAs being checked, right? An ANA gets checked in most cases, probably for genuine care about the patient, not just someone's checking it maliciously, but to really see what's going on. But because it's so nonspecific, that patients get referred to rheumatologists, and that often can lead to clinics being backlogged. So could this lead to more backlog because more patients are being referred to rheumatologists and may be appropriate? Maybe. It's hard to say yet, but I think it's a concern we should be thinking down the road as to what is our access to care going to look like as you incorporate these AI symptom models into both physician care as well as for patient education and patient awareness.
Awesome. Such a great point, Suleiman. How else do you envision AI impacting healthcare?
I think patient monitoring and management we're touching on recently is that the more data you can feed into these models, then theoretically the better prediction is. I think we've been hearing for some time about remote patient monitoring. They're very used to that in the cardiology world with defibrillators and pacemakers being to hook up into kind of telemedicine clinics and being able to monitor that. But I think in rheumatology, we haven't, outside of research studies, we haven't necessarily been giving our patients wearables to use and have that data feed back into our Epic chart so that we can see what their movement is. But the technology is technically there. It just has a matter of being synthesized together outside of a clinical trial scenario where it's come down to more clinical patient management, that perhaps if the patient gives access to their smartwatch accelerometer data and it's detecting this patient's gait is changing or they're having falls and they're an arthritic patient, or maybe they're a patient that has vasculitis, maybe is detecting mononeuritis multiplex because their gait is changing. That may be something to alert the office staff about, to check in on that patient sooner, to have them come back, assuming there is not already access to care issues that are going on. I think that's an example where it could really advance the understanding and usage of remote monitoring, but it again requires that synthesizing of all these different data sets together in a way that is genuinely helpful for patients.
Yeah. And as you said, the data is there. It's all about putting it together and making sense of it. And I think before AI, you would think it would be so complex to take all of these different data streams and put them together and provide medical recommendations or warnings saying the patient may be flaring or not. But now with AI, that could probably be done much easier. I was so impressed. So I wear an Aura ring, which is
Mm.
a ring that tracks my activities. And for the first time in my life, my wife and I decided to fix our little garden that we have in our back patio. And after I came in home, I checked my phone and the Aura Ring was able to detect that I was doing yard work.
Wow.
Somehow, based on, or I was digging or clearing out the weeds, it was able to say that I was doing yard work, which was incredible because I'd never done it before. So it's remarkable already the artificial intelligence that we're already using in our watches, in our rings, certainly in our cell phones, and just being able to leverage that to improve health, to detect health problems earlier, to detect disease flares. I think there's a huge potential there.
Agreed. I think that's something which we've been seeing proof of concept abstracts about in various congresses, including ACR. And I would expect a increased volume of that as the cost of this technology tends to go down and the accessibility of it tends to go up. I think two other areas which I'll touch on briefly, just out of disclosures of things that I do on my day job. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here. Is about treatment optimization. So I think we've been hearing a lot about personalized medicine. I remember years ago using vector DA testing when that first came out before Crescendo was bought over by LabCorp. That was one of the first sort of glimpses that we were thinking, oh, is this going to lead to personalized medicine? Unfortunately, it didn't, but I think it was a nice little tease of what a future could look like. But I think as you aggregate more of this data together about genomics and clinical care and population health, is that I think the hope for any patient is that instead of what we've been doing, which is a lot of, I would say, very thoughtful trial and error, and not that we randomly prescribe patients things or treat them with things, but thoughtful approach to management, that it becomes highly personalized as to what we've been seeing in the oncology world, or when they do genotyping on tumors and are able to say what is the treatment, or for many years in HIV, where you can do isotype testing on HIV and determine what is the best antivirals to use for those patients. So I think rheumatology, we'd be very much welcome to see what is the personalized medicine for patients. So obviously therapeutic development is a very important target for a lot of researchers, a lot of companies to look at. Can you use large data models of proteomics and try to figure out therapeutic targets that were not seen before, or using orphan medications in that regards for trying to leverage work that was done in the past? And then I think also in terms of research and data analysis. So this is what we were touching on the base earlier, is that those of us that are clinical care patients, you record your patient work in the chart. For many years, our EHRs are really glorified billing platforms, but they are recording. Our notes are being put in there. And these patients who are in the insurance-based system, their information is being aggregated on claims data. And so we've been seeing for years use of claims data for real-world evidence generation. But as you synthesize and integrate all these things, your EHR data, your claims data, wearable data, also all that too, or then incorporating genetics and proteomics into there, this could really open up, it is opening up tremendous opportunities for research in looking at patients beyond what we've seen in traditional registries, and really trying to understand disease at a very fundamental level, both retrospectively and prospectively. And I think the more research we have, the better data we have, and the better that we can do for our patients. That's two big, giant buckets. I won't get too deep in the weeds on, but I think one would expect that there's a lot of investment, a lot of interest in that. And I think if you just are a casual peruser of abstracts to any major congress, if you just look at what's coming out, you'll see that these are tools that are being readily utilized now.
Yeah, I think it's so exciting. Instead of starting every patient with rheumatoid arthritis on methotrexate and then as first line a TNF inhibitor, which is what insurance companies usually request, is to be able to analyze your patient and says, no, for this patient, an IL-6 inhibitor may be better, or a JAK inhibitor, or maybe a TNF inhibitor, or maybe they just need hydroxychloroquine. How cool would it be to have the availability of that knowledge when you first meet the patient, instead of, like you mentioned, this trial and error that may take 3 months, 6 months, a year, a couple of years to find the right mix of medications for patients.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think the other thing that we can think about to hopefully help is what can cause a big sense of burnout for a lot of providers is the administrative burdens that all of us see on the clinical end, whether it's how much time you have per patient, documenting notes or charting, ordering diagnostic tests or prior authorizations, or all of these sort of administrative roadblocks that separate the provider from patient care. Is there a role for AI in this sort of administrative efficiencies and workflows? And there is. We were talking in the beginning about how do we see this being used in real time. I can talk into an Amazon Echo and ask it to do certain tasks. Now, granted, it's a very if this, then that. It's listening at all times. So if you say certain keywords, then it'll kick off a program. But in a more robust setting, you could have your AI voice assistant scribe that's listening to you the entire time and is recording your notes. You don't have to chart anymore. And as you're speaking it loud, saying, I think that this may be your underlying issue, and why don't we order these tests? And so now it starts ordering the tests for you. And then it says, all right, we're going to start this therapy on you at this dose. So it's listening, it starts ordering that. And then as you come to the end of the visit, you're just reviewing what the AI had generated, signing off on it or making edits where appropriate, hitting submit. And then hopefully that all goes through. And if that helps you get through your day easier, then maybe you have more time for patients. Although the dystopian part of me thinks that just may tell your administrators, let's squeeze in an extra 5 more patients per day.
Yeah. I've seen glimpse of that over the last couple of weeks. I've started using an app that has been approved by our hospital for AI, what they call ambient listening, where you turn on the phone at the encounter. It records the entire encounter. I speak to the patient as I normally would, and they speak back. And maybe it's the patient and their mother, or the patient and their spouse. And the AI, at the end of the visit, after I press a button, will create a very concise and chronological history of present illness. And then for the physical exam, will record anything I said out loud that may be important, like a swollen digit or a limited range of motion in the hips. And then as I speak to the patient, I think you have rheumatoid arthritis. This is what we're going to do. It's going to try to write an assessment and plan.
You're living in the future, John.
So it's been pretty good. I have to say, it's pretty good. Certainly, I think the hardest thing is that assessment and plan. As a rheumatologist, we're taking a lot of things in our head and making conclusions that unless we speak them, they're not going to be noted in the note, like why we don't think the patient has lupus. Sometimes we don't say that, but it may be important because maybe the patient was referred for a question of lupus. So it's pretty good. And I think the other thing that was pretty good is that with a button, it prints out a page for the patient discussing, this is what we discussed. We discussed your joint pain. We think your joint pain is related to rheumatoid arthritis. Rheumatoid arthritis is a chronic autoimmune inflammatory disease of the joints, and your doctor wants to do some labs. And don't forget to take your methotrexate just once a week or something like that. So it's pretty good. It still doesn't have that next step that you mentioned that's going to be so cool, which is we're going to do an X-ray and it puts the order in Epic, or we're going to order methotrexate and it sends the prescription. But like you said, I think that's certainly coming.
So right now, you're validating your own data that's coming out of your AI exam room assistant. So at some point, you won't be validating your data anymore. It'll just be doing it.
Yeah. And I fear exactly what you said, that instead of us having more time with our patients, that we're going to have to just see more patients because now we're need less time for documentations. Right? That's right.
But I mean, like in some cases that access to care is very important. So I think if more patients get into a rheumatology office who truly have rheumatic illnesses, it's better for them.
But absolutely. I mean, I would trade any time, the 2 hours I spend at home documenting with just more time with patients.
100%.
100%.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Yeah. I think one thing, as we're kind of wrapping up here to make sure we're very cognizant of is about privacy and patient health information containing the sanctity of the doctor-patient trust. And this really comes down to good policy. So I think, end of the day is that the tech companies are not going to self-policy themselves, really, just in the nature of way technology works from what we've seen. And this is where advocacy is very important in terms of what organizations like the ACR can do, what individual medical societies can do on a state-by-state basis or a region-by-region basis, or providers on their local hospital board in terms of making sure that at every step of the way, these questions are asked is what is the privacy being safeguards for patients' data, for particularly as these large language models start integrating other data from around the country, and then making sure that those safeguards are always in place and installed. And I think one thing that gives me a lot of pause is a lot of us have read about the data breaches with 23andMe, which essentially leading to the company collapse. And that wasn't communicated for months to the people that paid for their genetic testing. That I think anyone who signs up for genetic testing, consumer-wise, knows that it can be used by law enforcement. So it's open to that. And that's part of the terms of service. But you would hope that it's not subject to hackers getting in and then releasing that data wherever it can go in potentially some nefarious areas. And clearly it didn't have enough safeguards involved to protect their clients' data. So I think, and that was millions of people's data. I think we want to be very cautious about that and make sure that if we're utilizing these things in our personal lives, in our clinical lives, that we are engaging with the healthcare system, whether it's society-based, state level, practice level, to make sure that safeguards are appropriately in place.
Amazing. Take us 5 years from now. How do you see rheumatology working in the age of AI?
Oh, great question. Yeah. I love kind of speculating. So I was just thinking as we're talking is that what will ACR guidelines look like in 10 years or even 5 years if we actually get closer to precision medicine for one or more of the hundreds of illnesses that a rheumatologist help to take care of? Will those guidelines have to change in some way to be very much more bespoke? Or will those involve some type of proprietary testing that we now are all going to be using? What will mean those tests? So hopefully, in a more optimistic sense, it means that we're able to take better care of our patients because they can be diagnosed at a sooner part before they have to wait to see a rheumatologist, and potentially that some management can even get started before they see a rheumatologist, get the ball going. That once a patient who has an illness that needs to be on treatment sees their way to a rheumatologist, that treatment can be monitored, their status can be monitored in a way that's better, more effective, so that their opportunity to have a more normal life and normal lifespan is given to them instead of suffering with their illness. But also on the preventative medicine end, you would hope too that we have more insights as to what it means to live a healthy life, what causes disease and illness, and how can people who may be at risk be identified early and interventions made so that they don't go on to develop something which can be more disastrous though. And then for those of us that are in the clinical setting is how do our lives work when we're managing patients with AI tools built in? And do we get back what we wanted going through medical training, which is that time with the patient to actually take care of them? And will the technological barriers that we have in front of us right now, those barriers get removed? I think a lot has to get seen before we can fully predict that. I think we can be optimistic, but it's going to take a lot of advocacy and policy to make sure that the sanctity of the patient-provider relationship is fully preserved. And then finally, our understanding of disease and illness and healthcare is being greatly expanded by utilizing these large data sets, but making sure that the data going in is verified data that has sanctity to it, that it's not garbage in, garbage out, so that we are making the best decisions in real time for our patients.
Amazing. Sounds like pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, hope for the best and prepare for the worst, I think is a good way to see things.
Awesome. Suleiman, thank you so much for your time. It's great to have you back on the show, and best of luck with everything that you do.
Always a pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.
Well, there you have it. Everything you ever wanted to know about artificial intelligence, but were afraid to ask. We talked about the excitement surrounding AI, its practical applications, and its potential to revolutionize patient care, research, and professional training. I found Dr. Bana's insights into the ethical and safety challenges of AI particularly enlightening. Thank you all for listening, downloading, subscribing to our show, and for rating us with 5 stars, or however many stars you think we deserve. You can find all of our show notes for this and other episode at acronair.org, on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on your favorite podcast app. Until next time, let's all embrace these new technologies without losing our humanity. And of course, stay healthy.